18th century furniture. Those are the POW, the pearls of wisdom, will be key features of the furniture. Before we begin going over the case, I just want to discuss the designation handmade, because many people get crazy when you say handmade. After all, they say the Model T was handmade because it required hands. When I talk about handmade, it's handcrafted. It's human energy. It's a hand tool with human energy. The only other power sources that have been used in a piece like this would be water power or pedal power. Otherwise, this is all handcrafted. The other thing I want to talk about is the word period. Everybody knows Victorian, but in order to identify a piece such as this, as say Queen Anne, we have to discuss the period prior to and the period after. So we have the William and Mary period, then we have Queen Anne, and now Queen Anne ruled until I guess 1714, but oddly enough, her period doesn't start until the 1720s to the 1760s. And then following the Queen Anne period will be the Chippendale. The reason I'm bringing the three periods up is because we have to, they didn't suddenly stop making William and Mary furniture and then suddenly start making Queen Anne, and then suddenly stop making Queen Anne and start making Chippendale. So there's some transition pieces, and that is how we can tell you if a piece is early Queen Anne, because it may have characteristics of William and Mary, or a late Queen Anne, it may have Chippendale characteristics. So that's why the period issue is going to be discussed. When my grandmother was having her apartment redone, her decorator asked her what period she wanted, and she said she wanted her friends to walk in, take one look, and drop dead, period. So, that's her idea of decorating. In any case, so as I said, in 1725, cabinet makers did not just stop making William and Mary. So interestingly, in this piece, there is one characteristic of William and Mary construction that I'll be showing you later on. We're going to take this piece apart, take the drawers out. We're going to discuss the construction of the case and the construction of the drawers. So pertinent negatives are as important as positives. What I mean by that is the absence of something is just as important as the presence of something else. So we'll be discussing what it doesn't have and what it does have, and why we're placing it in the Queen Anne period. This piece here is about 1750, and it was a gift from a friend of mine. Her name was Mary Lorimer Scouten Stone. She graduated nursing school in 1915. She was born in 1890 and she lived until 1972. But when she graduated nursing school in 1915, it was a time when less than 1% of the population, including men and women, pursued higher education. During nursing school, she met and married Dr. Chester Tilton Stone, who was a famous urologist, author. Both he and Mary descended from passengers on the Mayflower. And the complete provenance of this piece was given to me along with the piece by Mary. She identified this as a pre-revolutionary piece of furniture, and it descended to her through the Doty family, which was a Mayflower family. While there's no reason to doubt a verbal provenance, many times the information is incorrect, apocryphal, or they make mistakes. So we're not doubting what Mary says, but we're going to investigate this piece to determine that what she actually said is true. So if you look at this case, most people would look at it and say, well, it's old. And if you don't know very much about antiques, most people would say it's probably 100 or 150 years old. where in fact it's about 270 years old. Excuse me. And a lot of people would designate it as Victorian because to some people, everything is Victorian. But when you're trying to identify a piece, you have to look at the entire piece. And what you do is you pick out something, some identifying feature that you can zone in on. If you have the provenance, you can start there and see if the piece supports the provenance or not. But in this instance, we're just going to look at the piece and we're going to say, gee, it's interesting. It's 5/4 drawers. And we see this incredible carving here. Now, that's a fan carving. So if you don't know where to start, pick out something very unique about the piece and start there. Investigate fan carving. And if you do, if you go even yourself and go online and put in fan carving American furniture, you're gonna right away zoom in on a lead that will take you to what this piece is. So we're going to look at the elements of style, and that will. The interesting thing is, the construction will tell us when it was made, but the aesthetic features will tell us where it was made. And so not only are we going to date this, we're going to tell you exactly where it is from. So first you need to know what the piece is. You start with this piece, it's a chest of drawers. The interesting thing about this piece is you say it's a chest of drawers, but where are the feet? Where are the legs? A chest of drawers would normally stand on feet or legs. So you have to think, were the legs or feet cut off? We investigate. Right now, you can't see the bottom of the piece, but I can tell you that this has not been altered. This piece was meant to sit on another piece of furniture. So now we know that it is the top half of something. And we have two choices from that time period. We have either a chest on chest, or we have a highboy. Now, it gets very specific here. If it were a chest on chest, the body, the top half from side to side would be in the range of 40 to 50 inches. If it were the top half of a highboy, the width would be in the 36 to 44 inch range. Now you see there's an overlap here. What do you do if something is between 40 and 44? Well, you have to try to figure it out. Fortunately, our piece here, side to side, measures exactly 36 inches, not including the cornice. So from the body is 36 inches from side to side. So we know based on that, that it is the top half of a highboy. A highboy has legs, chest on chest has feet. Now in this instance, you'll see there's a configuration of 5/4 drawers. The drawers are graduated. This piece was meant to sit on another piece, and the reason they did the graduation of drawers is to actually draw your eye up to the top. So when you look at this, you're naturally drawn right up to the shell carving. This piece here has the same configuration, the 5/4 graduated drawers. So we look at this, and then we have to decide what is the wood that this is made out of. That will also help us with determine the region that this was made in. This happens to be constructed mostly of cherry. Cherry is a very, very dense, very heavy wood. It's got very straight grain, and it was a very popular wood to use during the 18th century. It was very, very, in the Northeast, it was a very common tree, along with the favorite woods at that time for constructing furniture was mahogany, walnut, cherry, maple. Then we have to discuss the primary and secondary woods. Primary woods are the woods you actually see, whereas secondary wood would be the wood you do not see. And the reason I have papers in these drawers are the drawers fit so tightly that if you do not designate where they're from, it's very difficult to find them, to put them back in. But in any case, as I was saying, primary woods are the woods you see. Secondary woods are the woods you were not meant to see. The interesting thing is, secondary woods, the favorite were poplar and pine. They were very soft and they were easy to use, especially with hand tools. The interesting thing about this piece is the secondary wood is also cherry. If you look at the grain, you'll see a very straight, tight grain. Now, what this tells us is this piece was made in a region that was very rich in cherry trees, because cherry was an expensive wood later on, and it was not typical to use cherry as a secondary wood, except at a time when there were so many cherry trees, which we would have had in the 18th century. So the primary and secondary woods are cherry. The interesting thing, feature on this piece is, additionally, the cross rails are maple, and that was done for contrast. So then we have to ask ourselves, is the patina, which is the finish, is it correct for something that's supposed to be mid-18th century? Does the wood display appropriate wear for something from the 18th century? Do we see expected tool marks from something in the 18th century? And then just again, is the construction right? So we'll be going through those step by step. We will investigate this piece, and of course we won't need our deer stalker or our pipe. So the first thing we're going to look at here is the patina. Now, wear does not occur uniformly. You're going to see wear in places. You're going to see wear all over in different places, but most especially you'll see the wood is lighter where people tend to grasp it and close the drawer. You're going to see wear along here. You're going to see wear inside where wood meets wood. And interestingly, if you look at the very sides, you'll see where the sides of the drawer slide in and out. But then there are these two furrows. They're actually furrows. And what has happened is, if you look at this drawer, you'll note that the back is fastened by two rosehead nails. These are handmade nails. And over 200 years, pulling it in and out has left those furrows. So you have to find stuff like this on old furniture. Now, if you look at the outside wood and inside wood, they're the same, but there's two different colors. This is very dark, a dark, rich brown, whereas inside it's lighter. That's because the exposed surfaces are exposed to the outside elements and oxidation, whereas the inside surfaces are not exposed, and they tend to stay lighter than the outside surface. And if you find a piece where the wear or the finish is uniform, then you have to suspect that it has been refinished, or that it's a newer piece. So we're gonna, this definitely has age-appropriate wear in all parts of the moving pieces. So the other thing we're gonna look at is the tool marks. When they made furniture during the 18th century, they used 3 different planes. The first plane they used was called a foreplane, or the jack plane. That was used for hogging off, heavy pieces of wood. Now, the pieces that are not exposed, they would not have been so keen to finish. Now, I don't know if you're going to see this, but if you rake the light across this, you may see ripples, but you definitely feel ripples. This is where the plane just cut off the heavy materials. And as you can see, there's knot holes. So the secondary woods were just left unfinished. If you ever find a piece with the secondary woods finished, be very suspicious. They did not take the time to finish secondary woods. So on this back, we have two panels. They are chamfered, which in other words is the edges are beveled, and it is tacked in with handmade nails. That's another thing you have to look at. If there are nails or if there are screws, you have to determine if they are handmade. They did use screws in the late 18th century, but they were handmade screws. So there are ways to determine that. In this piece, the only thing that were used were rosehead nails, no screws at all. So then they would use, the next plane would be the joiner, which would smooth out the wood. And then they would have the smoothing plane. And when they plane this piece, they would plane it with the grain, then across the grain, then with the grain and across the grain. And you achieve this very smooth surface. So again, if you're looking for certain things. Now, all this wood had to be sawn. And if you look at this, I've made a little diagram here of what you might expect to see from wood cut on a pit saw as versus wood cut from a water-powered reciprocating saw. And then here, after 1840, there was a circular saw. So these are the marks you're looking for. And on this piece, inside on the secondary woods, we see uneven marks from a pit saw. We'll look at the inside of the case in a bit. But if you see these straight parallel marks, you'll know that it was a water-powered reciprocating saw, and that's later date. And then certainly any indication of a circular saw would have to be after 1840. So those are very important to look for when you're trying to identify a piece of 18th century furniture. And then you have to look at the construction. Pieces that were made in the 18th century are dovetailed. Now, if you take a quick look at the top here, you'll see the top is set in with dovetails. These are called through dovetails because you can see them. And it wasn't important to the cabinet maker that you could see them because this is the top of the piece. So they used very crude through dovetails. And here, if you look closely, you can see the scribe line where they actually put the line to indicate the depth of the pin, and this is the dovetail, this is the pin. So this is what you look for. You look for scribe lines. Now, each of the drawers are dovetailed and they all have scribe lines. This cornice is, most people would look at this and think of it as crown molding. The difference between a cornice and crown molding is that a cornice is meant to hang out over something, whereas crown molding is placed where the wall meets the ceiling. But essentially, they're the same. This is very classic design on northeastern highboys or chest on chest. So then we'll start to look at the drawers. We'll take this apart. But these dovetails are not mechanically cut. These are hand cut dovetails. And again, I'm going to show you the dovetails where very early dovetails are large and crude. If you see the scribe line, you can see the scribe line here. They're widely placed and they're very large. As we got later into the 18th century and early 19th century, the dovetails, the pins became more narrow at the base. You see here, the difference between this and this. This is a later dovetail. Then again, these are handmade dovetails, and these are, again, smaller than the original of the ones from the 18th century, and they're widely placed. This is also late to early 19th century. And then just for contrast, these are machine cut dovetails. They're uniform, they're the same size, same distance. So when you see this, you know this is machine cut. There are no overcuts. If you look here, you'll see where the saw went beyond, right here as well, beyond. You will never see that in machine cut dovetails. So if you do see this, it's machine made. This here, again, this is the dovetail, and this is the pin. The small part is the pin, the large part is the dovetail. This is the side of a drawer, and here you can see the scribe line much better. So when we're looking at the drawers, the first thing we're going to look at is the front. Now, interestingly, here again, we're going to mention the period prior to and the period after Queen Anne. In the William and Mary period, they used what they called the arch molding. It is actually part of the cabinet. When you pull the drawer out, this part does not come out. After this period, they used cock beading, which was applied to the drawer or actually cut into the drawer. This part would come out with the drawer. In the Queen Anne period, you don't see either of those. You do not see the arch molding and you do not see the cock beading. What you see is really, really cool. It is, on most drawers, you could take a piece of paper and slip it in. On Queen Anne pieces, the drawer is made with a lip. The lip hides the drawer opening. Another feature that's very interesting, that's telltale of this time, is the lip will be on three sides of the drawer, on the side, the top, and the other side. You will not find a lip underneath. It's flat. The reason for this is this piece is very high. And to get a drawer out, you'd have to reach up and pull it out and place it on something to go through it. If it had a lip, the lip would eventually be damaged, broken off. So this is why these are flat. The other interesting thing about this is if you look at the back, the sides of the drawers are much lower than the front. This allows for climacteric expansion. So these things would expand in hot weather. And if they weren't cut lower, these would rub when they opened. Now you'll notice that the sides go down. There's the dovetails, but the back is cut even. This trench here is called a dado. That is cut into the side of the drawer so they can slide the bottom in. Then the back of the drawer is placed above the dado. You'll never see the back of the drawer go down beyond. You will always see it cut even with the dado, and the bottom of the drawer sticks out a bit. And if it hits the case, this is the part that hits the case rather than this. The other interesting thing about the drawer is you will notice they're chamfered. It's a very thick piece of wood. Again, you see that beautiful, tight, straight grain of cherry. And what you'll find on all 18th century furniture is that the drawers are thick, the bottoms, but they are chamfered or beveled to fit into this trench or dado. So those are other things you will look for. The back of the drawer is always secured to the bottom of the drawer with probably just 2 nails. And again, you look at the nails and they're handmade, hand-cut nails. An interesting thing about the nails is that they had a very high carbon content. So if you look here, you'll notice that on this nail, and you'll see this on 18th century furniture, the carbon actually leaches into the wood over 200 years. So if you see nails with a very clean area around them, again, be suspicious, because after 200 years or more, the iron will have leached out into the wood. So anytime you see a nail, you should see this staining around the wood. If you don't, the nails were just put in. Even if they're handmade, they could still make handmade nails, but they can fake the leaching into the wood. So when we look at this piece here, the other thing we're going to look at is the hardware, which is very, very important, because over 200 years, it's quite possible that people have changed the hardware. Let's see if this one comes out easier. What you're going to look at is During the 18th century, the nuts were always round. So if we look at this, we'll see it's round. It's not square or octagonal like we're used to. This is a round nut. And then the other components are the posts. The posts, interestingly enough, very early posts would be square between the ball and the threads. This post is round between the ball and the threads, which indicates a date of after, say, 1740s. So we know that this piece was not made earlier than that. The other interesting thing that you have to look for in a drawer that will tell you if the hardware was replaced is you can look and see on the front of the drawer. It may not be quite so noticeable, but there's a plug. If you look at the inside, we see 3 holes. Why do we see 3 holes when the pull has only 2 holes? Interestingly enough, William and Mary, during the William and Mary period, which was just prior to this, most pulls had 1 hole. They were teardrops. So it's quite possible that when this piece was made, it had the older William and Mary pieces in it, pulls on it, and they updated them shortly after construction, because these pulls are sand cast. That's another very important thing you must look for. If you look at the front of this, you'll see a nice piece of brass. It has some oxidation, but the back is almost black. And I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but there's stippling. And these are actual burn marks. And the stippling is an impression of sand. These are sand cast. Up until about 1780, all the hardware was sand cast. In other words, they made an impression, and they made a mold, pressed it into sand, and then they poured the molten brass in. And that is why the back has the burnt mark and the scratchy, sandy feeling. Again, then after they took it out, they had to file any burrs off the side. So you will actually see, if you look with a loop or something, you can see the file marks. After 1780, brass was rolled. So they were able to roll brass and make flat brass, and these things were punched out. So after 1780, you would expect to see a back that is as smooth and clean as the front. Once you see that the back is burnt and has pebbly feeling and impressions of sand, you know these brasses were made before 1780. So that's a very important feature to look at. The other thing that you look at is if you see these bales, these bales, they enter the balls from the inside. Now, prior to this time, prior to Queen Anne, if you look at the pull there, the Queen Anne pulls enter the ball from the outside. These are very, very slight differences, but they're really key when you're looking at 18th century furniture. So when you see bales on I mean, they did make bales, they reproduced bales, and all this hardware was reproduced and still made for many, many years. But when you put it all together, this is when it helps. But when you see the bale entering the ball from the outside, it's indicative of a William and Mary piece, whereas later pieces, such as Queen Anne and Chippendale, the bale enters the ball from the inside. And this is what we see in this piece. We see that the bale enters the balls from the inside. Okay, now as I'm going to take the drawers out, and this piece here, let's talk about this while I have this drawer out. When you see this wood is not completely finished, which is great. This is what you want to see. If you look at the back, you'll see it's very crude. And this is called a rabbet. The way this sits in here is called rabbet. You will not see this from the front. And then you will not see the dovetails from the front. These are called blind dovetails because you cannot see them from here, whereas these are through dovetails. You can see them clearly. So the interesting thing with this particular drawer is we see this crack up here. And you're like, oh, darn, it's damaged. This is beautiful. This is what we want to see. What happens is when they put the bottom of the drawer in, they fix it at the sides. So and the front, the back, the sides. So they fix it with nails. This board does not move as it would if it were a panel. After 200 years, this wood shrinks. And what happens when a piece of wood is fixed and it has no place to pull? It will split. And the splitting is exactly what we would expect and exactly where we would expect it. As wood ages, it does not shrink. It shrinks across the grain. So here we have the grain. The wood would shrink this way. The wood does not shrink this way. So naturally, as it shrinks this way, this is where we would expect to see the crack because the wood is pulling on itself. And you'll always see the crack running with the grain, never across the grain. So as I say, the wood is pulling on itself. This is shrinking. These growth lines here were at one time a little further apart. So as these growth lines got closer, it pulled on itself and broke right along the grain. So that's another thing. When you open a piece and you see that, don't be disappointed. That's like, that's great. That's a nice feature to see in your drawers. If you look at the backs, you'll see how crude the dovetails are. And the secondary wood, it was not a concern to them. You'll see it's imperfect. When we look inside, we'll see big knot holes. It's a very, very heavy piece, of course, because it is cherry. The sides, again, the cherry wood was so plentiful, they didn't have to scrimp, and these sides are so thick. The sides, the back. This is another indication of a very early piece, whereas later pieces, if you have any later pieces, just open them up. You will not see a side this thick. You will not see a front that thick or a back that thick. And again, you can see the beautiful straight cherry grain. So we know this piece is from the Northeast, where cherry was very, very plentiful. Again, we see splitting in the base of the drawer going along the grain. And inside we see deep gouges where they put the, you will also see that where they place the bolt, the nut. Now, the drawer rails in this piece here, look at this piece here, look at the side of the drawer here. That's a secondary wood, they didn't care about it. So if you find a piece with beautiful secondary wood, all finished, no knot holes, be very suspicious. Be very suspicious. Because if they tell you it's a steal, it probably is a steal, and it's probably them doing the stealing. So you have to know your stuff. You can't rely on, you know, antique dealers, because unfortunately, most antique dealers today are really dealers in collectibles, and they don't know very old antique furniture very well. So you have to be your own investigator. Here again, you'll see the knot holes. They were not concerned. Beautiful, beautiful dovetails here. Large, crude. Again, you see the scribe line. So these are all imperfections you want to see in your furniture. Now, the interesting thing about this piece is the rails. What I mean by the rails are the rails that guide and support the drawer. So if you look inside, these are the rails here. And if you can see, they're just simply nailed to the side of the case. Now, during the Queen Anne period and Chippendale period, which would be the mid to late 18th century, the rails were placed in trenches. They actually would carve a trench in the side of the case, set the rail in there, and then fix it with 1 or 2 nails. During the William and Mary period, they did not use a trench. They simply nailed the draw rail to the side, and that's what you see here. So this does have elements of a William and Mary piece. The other interesting thing you'll note is the rails do not meet the front or the back. Again, that allows for an expansion of the wood. If you look at the back, you'll see how crude it is, especially in that corner where there's an opening. They didn't care. The knot fell out, they still used it. Would, to get a nice big piece flat, to get a piece of wood that large, that smooth, was very, very time consuming. So of course they wouldn't let something like that deter them from using a piece of wood. Now, let's see if we can see some saw marks. If you look at the sides, especially here, lower down, you will see some marks. Yeah. Hopefully you can see they're very uneven. There's nothing symmetrical about them. And this is all indicates hand sawing or pit sawing. So right now we're looking at a piece of furniture that has many almost all mid 18th century characteristics. And yet there's some residual characteristics from the William and Mary period. So we know that this is early in the Queen Anne period, which would have been about 1725 to 1760. So we know this is on the earlier side because we do see the draw rails that you would expect to see in the earlier period. So I like to call that draw your own conclusion, but yeah, the draws are very, very important. Draw construction is very important. Now, as I was saying before, if you are able to slide a piece of paper into the carcass without moving the drawer, it is not a Queen Anne piece. So that's a very interesting fact to remember. And now dovetails, they've been used since ancient Chinese used them, the Egyptians used them. They're actually used in building construction. But we do not start to see dovetails in American furniture until the early 18th century. We do not see that in furniture that's from say the 17th century or periods prior to the 18th century. And the other thing you want to look for is the grain in the bottom of the drawer. During the William and Mary period, the grain ran front to back. Queen Anne, Chippendale, the grain typically runs side to side. In this piece, interestingly, we have the grain running front to back and the grain running side to side, which tells me again that it is probably a transition piece between William and Mary or a very early Queen Anne piece. If you look here at this here, you can clearly see what they call an overshoot. When they're cutting the wood to put the dovetail in, there's always an overshoot. This makes chipping out the wood less difficult. So this is another feature you want to look for on dovetailed pieces. The other interesting thing is, if you'll notice, the back of the drawer is slightly rounded. The reason for this is these pieces were up very high. So if you pull the drawer out, you would pull it out this way. If you were going to insert it again, you'd have to do it from the bottom, and you want the back to be slightly rounded, because if they were sharp corners, they would invariably catch. So these are all just little telltale signs about the age and construction. So we've narrowed it down to, say, based on the wood and based on the construction, we're giving this a date of mid-18th century, about 1750. We're calling it a piece from the Northeast region because the secondary woods are all cherry, which is very unusual in later pieces. More inexpensive, softer woods like pine and poplar would have been used. So right now we got the date kind of set down. And what we want to do, we've discussed the hardware. It's very important that you look, when you buy a piece, if you take a pull off and look at the back of the plate, you need to find the that it was sand cast. Now, that's not an absolute way to identify the date, but that's the best way to identify the brasses. If the brasses are not sand cast, of course, they could have been replaced at a later date. That doesn't mean the piece of furniture is not 200 years old. If the pieces are sand cast, they could have been bought and placed on a newer piece of furniture. So you have to consider all the elements together, not just one. You can't look at a pull and say, this is 200 years old, therefore the piece of furniture is 200 years old. Or you can't look at a pull and say, this is stamped brass, it's flat on the back, so this piece can't be 200 years old. Brasses were changed all the time, especially modernized. That's how they would modernize their pieces. So the hardware is very important, but again, you have to consider the hardware with all the other elements. So right now we've said the Northeast, which is a pretty big region. The one design element that we see that's very different from everything else that we see in this piece is this carved shell. And this, the aesthetic features, tell us where a piece was made. Each region had their own aesthetic feature. Even if it was a carved fan, it was very different. Rhode Island had their own, Massachusetts had their own, Connecticut had their own, and Pennsylvania had their own. So we look at this fan, and even if we don't know where this piece is, we can investigate. We say, carved fan. Start looking at carved fans on antique furniture, and you will see all the different designs. And really, based on the fan, you can actually narrow it down to the state. So if we look again at the fans, we will see a Rhode Island fan with these little festoons. We will see a Boston fan that is festooned but not deeply, and then we see the Connecticut fan, which ends in points. And this is exactly what we see here. On this piece, the fan is clearly a Connecticut fan. It ends in the points with very deep festooning. There's concave and convex carving in this fan, which is also very typical of Connecticut. But the other key feature that you see typically only in a Connecticut piece is the 5/4 drawer configuration. The large central drawer, 2 smaller drawers on each side, over 4 larger drawers. That is very classic for Connecticut. So based on the construction, on the patina, the wear, the presence of all the right tools, the tool marks, the wood, and the aesthetic feature of the fan, we know that this is a Connecticut piece, and it is from about 1750. So this piece is essentially 270 years old. And we know that it's earlier in the Queen Anne period because it does have characteristics of the previous period. Now, there are no characteristics really here that are classic for Chippendale. Of course, some of the same things were used, some of the same construction designs. Now, if you look at the front, the other thing that we see is the rail, the drawer supports are also dovetailed into the surrounding wood. And this is what you need to find. You need to find these pieces with the dovetails exposed. Now, it's interesting because on this piece here, if you look, let's say, these are through dovetails. They were meant to be seen. But there's a great deal of wear, especially on the drawers. And on one of the drawers, which I will try to find for you, for instance, this. Now, if you look at this side of the drawer, you do not see the dovetails. These are half-blind dovetails. You do not see them from the front. If you look at the other end, you see the dovetails, but you also see this incredible wear. Incredible wear. Where you actually, the wood is actually worn so deeply, you do see the dovetails. This is not meant to be seen. It's meant to be exactly like this. But over 250 years of wear, And we don't know why this drawer wore on this side alone, except that maybe that's always where they grabbed this drawer. But you can actually see the wear right across here. So that might be a deterrent to some people, but to me, it's beautiful because it tells you exactly when this piece was made. So I think we pretty much covered everything. The other thing I'd like to talk about are wormholes. On a piece this old, it would not be unusual to find wormholes. Now, wormholes are a misnomer because wormholes are actually made by beetle larvae. And the beetles lay their eggs and the larva eats the wood. When people are faking antique furniture, they make fake wormholes. When you come across a piece, if it does have wormholes, the best way to tell if they were man-made by some human worm as versus the actual beetle larva is just a straight pin, sewing needle. A sewing needle will never, ever pass into a natural wormhole very far. If it's a man-made wormhole, the needle will pass right in because wormholes were never straight. They were corkscrewed. So that's another thing you might want to consider when you're looking at a piece. If it has wormholes, stick a pin in. If the pin goes in, walk away. They're faked wormholes. So I think that it probably pays to be suspicious, and you can't take everything at face value when you're told about a piece in an antique shop or at a show. You have to know what to look for, because very often if you take someone's word for it, you wind up being very disappointed. So the piece has to prove itself. So I think it's better to begin as a skeptic and end as a believer than to begin as a believer and end up disappointed. So always be skeptical, and always, if you look at my transcript and you print it out, clip out the POWs, those POWs, those pearls of wisdom, and just put them in together and refer to them. And you won't be able to go wrong on these pieces. So what we have, again, is the top half of a Queen Anne sideboard from Connecticut, about 1750. And I hope you enjoyed this. I've had this piece of furniture for about 50 years. And again, you can see the crude secondary woods. And then as we turn it, the beautiful finished primary wood. And again, very, very important, look for uneven wear, because an old piece will not wear evenly. There's always a place where someone's hand has always touched repeatedly. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take some questions.
Okay, so the first question is, what happened to the bottom half?
What happened to the bottom half? The Stone family lived in a very big estate on North Murray and Ridgewood. Right now, I think there are probably 6 or 7 houses on their property. When Dr. Stone died, unfortunately, his wife was, I guess, cheated is the good word for it, out of unscrupulous people buying his stamp and book collections. And unfortunately, they had to leave the big house, and they moved to a smaller house on Van Deen. And when they moved, they could only take select pieces of furniture. And unfortunately, this was too tall for the house they moved in. And they just left whatever they had in the house when they moved. So, yeah.
And do you know how much it is worth?
Well, what is it worth? Chest on chest, high boys. The price varies. If you can identify the maker, of course, that's going to add quite a premium to a piece. These pieces sell, years ago, they would sell in the tens and tens of thousands. Right now, a good piece in this condition, complete, intact from that time period, you could probably expect to pay, depending on the condition, the primary and secondary woods, the construction, 10,000 to 20,000 or more. They've many of these high boys, especially in the Israel Sachs collection, go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's a very varied thing. It's dependent on the piece itself.
And how can you tell the difference between saw marks from a water-powered frame saw and a more modern bandsaw?
Again, if we look at the saw marks here, a pit saw, which is done by hand, is never, ever, ever, ever uniform, because you have the jerky motion of two men, one in the pit and one above, moving the saw up and down, stopping, the saw catches, so that saw mark stops, then they pull again, and so this is what you would see. When you see straight, parallel, uniform, same distance, then you know that's a water-powered saw. And then once you see the circular, then you know it's a circular saw, bandsaw, and that's after 1840. So that's the only way to tell. And it's very distinct, and you can look at a piece. And if you even have to take a magnifying glass, look at the interior. The interior will tell you so much about a piece. The outside is finished, the outside is beautiful, the outside is smooth. They've done everything they could to take the tool marks away. They didn't do it on the inside. It was not cost effective. It was not worthy of their time. That is how you can tell the difference between saw marks.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions? You can use the chat feature or the question and answer. And we have time for a few more if anybody has any other questions for Anthony. All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Anthony, for the presentation. It was
Thank you.
A lot of information. We will have a handout that I'll send out to everybody afterwards. So I'll send an email hopefully in the next day or so with that information. Again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to the Ridgewood Library. My name is Sarah Kiefer, local history librarian, so I'm happy to answer any other questions as well. And please do join us for the Quilt and Coverlet show on Friday and Saturday. The presentation is on Saturday. You can attend at the Ridgewood Library or virtually. So we have two ways of registering. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.